Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and today we're going to continue our look at not First Corinthians, Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 13. We've been talking about the idea that God made a promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and that this would be fulfilled through Isaac. It was carried out through his chosen people, the Jews, and now with the new covenant of Jesus, we're hearing that not all the Jews get in, only those who follow Jesus. Well, wait a second. Paul also says that God's original promise to Abraham is being kept just the way he intended. How can it be kept if some of the Jews aren't in? And Paul says, well, not every descendant of Abraham is a descendant of Abraham. You say not every Jew is a Jew. Yeah, they are. An Israelite is obviously somebody who can trace their heritage back to Abraham. They're related to Abraham. And they trace that heritage through Jacob and Isaac. There's no other way to be a Jew. It was a bloodline. And it doesn't make sense for someone who didn't have that bloodline to say they did. If I told you that I'm French, could you tell if I'm lying or not? No. If you're curious, I'm not French. But you'd have no way of knowing just by looking at me. But if I told you I was Korean, okay, you might be able to tell. I don't think so. Um, you can't just change to a heritage that isn't yours. And this is almost is what Paul is saying here, that not every Jew who thinks they're a Jew are a Jew. Well, yeah, they are. How does this work? Now, to solve this puzzle of how God could still keep his promise that Abraham was going to have the chosen people, but not all those chosen people are the ones God's choosing, we have to find out what Paul really means when he says not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. What does that mean? Well, Paul uses two examples to show who God's people genuinely are. All right, let's look at verse 7 now. Nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Okay, this is a bit of a trick question. Let me say this again. Are all of Abraham's descendants Jews? Technically, no, because he had another son. He had Ishmael. What's the difference? Ishmael had a normal biological birth. Ishmael was his son by Sarah's handmaiden Hagar. All right? But Isaac was born by a miracle. And you know the story that Sarah's in her 80s, Abraham is in his 90s when they had the kid, too old to have children, never been able to have children. It's a miracle. And that's what sets Isaac's descendants apart. They're people who were created because one man trusted in God that he would do what he promised. They're the children of the miracle. All right? With that in mind, that Abraham's descendants, unlike his descendants from Ishmael, were the children of the miracle, let's read verses 8 and 9. In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. For this was how the promise was stated: at the appointed time I will return, and Sarah will have a son. It is the children of the promise. All right, now what is a Christian? Well, that's somebody who, whether they can trace their bloodline back to Abraham or not, they trusted in God. Paul is saying that a Christian is somebody who trusts in God's promise, just like the Israelites were. All right? A Christian is somebody who, whether their bloodline is Jew or Gentile, trusted that God would do what he promised, and that promise was to save us through Jesus. Who's more like Abraham then? Some 35th generation great, 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 great grandson of Abraham? Or somebody who took the same step that Abraham took and trusted that God would keep his promise? Later on in the story of the Jews, we see during the time of Samuel, Eli, the priest, had two sons. And in that day, you were supposed to hand your priestly heritage on to your sons. In other words, you're a priest because your dad is a priest. But Eli's sons had no interest in God. They wanted all the authority of being a priest. They didn't want any of the faith that went along with it. And handing his craft on to them was a disaster. He ended up handing it on to Samuel because Samuel had faith where his sons didn't. The same principle basically is true for all trades, isn't it? If you're a carpenter and your son has no interest in being a carpenter, okay. My dad worked for Lockheed. He wanted to know if I wanted a job at Lockheed. I had no interest in working for Lockheed. Okay, my sons are not in ministry. It didn't interest them. It's true in any profession. The profession is handed on to those who have an interest in it, and that's what faith is. Faith is handed on to those who have an interest in it. All right. Now, since my phone is continually wanting to turn off, thank you. Let me get it on again. Let's look at verses 11 through 13. I'm sorry, 10 through 13. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I love, but Esau I hated. Right? Now we have another example of this. Abraham's son, Isaac, had two sons. But Jews are only traced through the younger son, Jacob. They're not traced through the older son, Esau. So even if you can trace your bloodline all the way back to Isaac, okay, hang on, it's got to be traced through Jacob. Why Jacob? Why didn't God carry on the promise through Esau? Well, because God chose Jacob. When he says, I loved Esau, but I loved Jacob, but I hated Esau, it doesn't mean that God didn't like him. It means I chose him. I chose him. That's who I chose to carry my covenant through. Before he was even born, God chose Jacob to continue the same promise he had made to Abraham. But what did Jacob do to deserve this, to earn it? Nothing. God decided it. What Jacob did was to be willing to choose to accept the gift. Okay, that's the key. What did you do to deserve being saved? Not a thing. Before you were born, God decided, I am going to give this gift to those who have faith. God's criteria is those who believe in my son, not, not what your bloodline is, but those who believe in my son are the ones who are going to be saved, are going to be part of the covenant. So, what's a Christian? It's someone who's saved by Jesus. What do we do to earn that? Nothing. It's a gift. We just have to be willing to accept that gift, and accepting that gift is called faith. We'll talk more about this next time. Till then, have a great day.